JayEmm on Cars is kindly sponsored by Car Vertical, the only car history checking service you'll need, which references more than 20 databases globally to make sure you don't buy a car with a hidden past. For a special discount on the service, please use the link in the description down below. And now, today's feature presentation.
Bit of a mixed day for me today. I turned up here in a McLaren. I will soon be driving a TVR, but right now I am hopping in a 2017 VW Polo. And yet I'm quite excited to try this car because it's another entry in my Cool Cars for Young People playlist, and it's a very close relation to a couple of vehicles I've recently featured, namely the Skoda Fabia VRS. The last one of those that I featured was a second generation Fabia VRS powered by Volkswagen's very unusual and somewhat unreliable twin-charged engine that had a turbo and a supercharger. That car was roughly equivalent to the Mark V Polo GTI, which also got the same power plant. Now they later did improve it and make it a little bit more reliable, but there are a lot of people out there for whom it's not a car they want to go near, or it's just perhaps a little bit too much beyond their budget. And if you're a young person looking for a small, affordable, yet fun car which has an automatic, your choices are rather limited. It's very easy for us to either overlook or simply forget the fact that there are quite a few people out there for whom a manual simply isn't an option. And in this day and age, there is no reason at all why those people can't still experience a really enjoyable drive. I will confess I was the sort of person who always used to turn their nose up at anybody that bought any kind of automatic, particularly stuff like the old Tiptronics you get in 911s and that kind of stuff, because, well, they were horrible gearboxes. And then eventually I began to realise there were people out there who either didn't care about the performance gain or the interaction you got from a manual, or more accurately, the people who simply could not drive manuals anymore. They'd had motorbike crashes and stuff like that, or in the case of this car's owner, a nasty skiing accident that left him really unable to drive a manual for extended periods of time. But he didn't want that to dampen his spirits, so he went off looking for something to replace his Mini Cooper D, a car which for him was equal parts fun and sensible. And I've got to say, I think on the face of it, he's done rather well. This is a late Mark V Polo, and in comparison to the Skoda Fabia that I drove, which is a few years older, does feel a little bit more upmarket again. It actually feels reasonably modern in here. Apparently, a lot of the infotainment system was adopted pretty much straight from the Mark VII Golf, and all the controls are pretty much what I'd expect from a VW. They're in the right place. I like this simple infotainment and HVAC system, which has a useful mix of touchscreens and physical controls. So all the really important stuff you've got an actual button or dial for, and the rest of it you can do on the touchscreen. Works perfectly. We never ever needed anything more complicated than that, I think. You can get people in the back, and indeed this car's even had a stag do in it once. Not the entire stag do, it just transported some people around. And the boot you'll find is actually a good size. Not great, but it's decent for a car in this class. Where this scores very highly is on the numbers front. It doesn't have the same power as the GTI. This late version apparently is 150 horsepower versus the 180 in the top model, but it has exactly the same amount of torque, 250 newton meters, or about 184 pound-feet. That apparently is about equal to the first Fiesta ST. If anything, it might actually be slightly more, although very few of those are standard these days. In terms of kit, it's not quite as well equipped as the Ford, I would say. It's got this very odd interior with this MGZR Tribute Blue trim. Very weird, but, you know, hey-ho. These seats are actually quite comfortable, quite sportive. They're not the largest, but I fit in them just okay. The 7-speed DSG gearbox does its job absolutely fine. It's changing through the gears, no trouble at all, and I suspect it'll be exactly the same unit as was in the Fabia. More numbers to impress you. On the way down here today, this car achieved more than 50 to the gallon. Because he does an awful lot of miles, Tom did need a car which was relatively economical on the motorway, although in his words, when you're having fun, it's still just as bad on fuel as everything else you might imagine. As this is a cool car for young people, you will also be looking at things like tax, and I'll confess, I don't even think about tax anymore on cars these days because whatever I buy tends to be really expensive to tax, so yeah, I just try not to think about it. This, though, 30 quid a year. And although Tom is now in his early 30s, this was also quite a bit cheaper to insure than the equivalent GTI. Half the price, actually. £300 a year he pays for insurance on this versus £600 he was quoted for the Polo GTI. That's quite a big saving for only a sort of 40 horsepower loss. I think it's not a bad looking car. It's pretty safe in the mould of most VWs, but there's nothing wrong with that. If this is the kind of thing that you want, I think it does it very well indeed. For the sort of boring stuff, I'd say the suspension feels just a little firmer than I thought it would. I've also noticed the car's just gone into 2-cylinder mode for a moment there. This can actually do cylinder deactivation, which is quite trick. It also has, because it's a later car, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, which was really key for him, and I totally understand why. That for me is just an essential now in my daily driver. It just makes life so much easier. In terms of price, these were about £17,000 new, but he picked this up with some miles on it, still fairly new, but quite a bit less than that, closer to around £12,000. And now you're probably going to be paying, say, around about £6,000 to pick up a reasonable example. So it's a couple grand more than the Fabia VRS, but I would say from in here, you feel like you're getting at least a couple grand more worth of stuff. There are some omissions though. Doesn't even have automatic headlights. Apparently they're not very good anyway, nor does it have heated seats or parking sensors. I'm not sure if you could even option those. Apparently VW were determined at the time to try and make this car a more affordable alternative to the Fiesta ST. But of course it doesn't perform like a Fiesta ST, so to try and make it cheap enough to justify, they had to take a lot of things out. And that's kind of a shame. Performance is reasonable though. I put my foot most of the way down there, but not all. Changed down a few gears swiftly, smoothly, and between 2,000 and 4,000 RPM, this pulls with a real authority. Does it rev out? Let's see. So I'm going to bump into manual mode now. There is a sporty mode if you want it. It is the top third of the rev range where you can really feel how this car's performance has been restricted. With other cars, like the Fabia for example, it really does want to rev all the way, yet with this, it's in the mid-range where you want to keep it. Now in fairness, I did recall saying a similar thing about the Fabia, but this, you really can tell, it just kind of doesn't get any faster after 4,000 RPM. Unlike a diesel, it will happily rev to its £6,500 red line. Diesels tend to sort of fall short very, very quickly, and this doesn't. It holds its power pretty well. Brakes are not over servo, that's nice. As I've just got out of the McLaren, which has a sort of fairly firm brake pedal, it's quite easy just to sort of break your neck in something like this, but no, it's doing well. Response from that engine is really good. For engine geeks, the code of it is EA211. A close relative, I think, of the twin-charged item, which was also a 1.4. I think that was an EA111. Don't quote me on that. Can get these things wrong. So this being maybe not a hot, but a lukewarm hatch, let's see how it fares in some twisty bits. It's on those kind of roads where this car doesn't feel like it really deserves the GT moniker. It feels much more Bluemotion than GTI. However, if you're careful, you can still make reasonable progress, but it does require some forward planning because this car is not very agile at all. It's got Avon tyres on it, which are not the best in the world, but they're also far from the worst, and they were chosen because they're some of the quietest that you can find. That's an unusual reason to choose a tyre, but, well, why not? If you're doing this many miles, I guess you want this car to be reasonably livable, and it is. What you just don't get from this car though is the sort of the fizz and the joy and the excitement, that little sparkle you get from a proper hot hatch. It does actually drive quite old school though. I think fans of, say, the early Golfs, that kind of stuff, Mark 1 GTIs, would find a lot to like about this car because it's punchy enough, but it's still quite compliant, especially when you do start pressing on. The suspension does start to work fairly well. There's always just a little bit of jitter in it, but it's probably as much to do with the short wheelbase as it is anything else. I feel like I can lean on it a bit more than I do in, say, like an up GTI. I'm always slightly wary with cars like that look far too upright, but that's the fourth Ferrari I've seen this morning. Saw a Testarossa. It might have been a 512 TR, but I think it was an original Testarossa. That was being followed by a 488 GTB, and then going the other way on the motorway, I saw a 355, which is still, I think, one of my favourite cars of all time. Very keen to go into two-cylinder mode this car. I've actually seen it go into that about 4 or 5 times now. Considering I'm driving it generally with some enthusiasm, I'm surprised at that. Yeah, response is decent, not spectacular, but good. You're not waiting for the turbo too long, seems fairly consistent, and yet between 2 and 4 grand, well, you want to keep it. It can start to get a bit floaty. You really push on. This is a very tricky section of road. This is why I like it so much, but it can start to feel like you're driving a bouncy castle a little bit. That does temper your enthusiasm in the bends, and that's probably for the best. It's really small though. I can place it easily enough. Yeah, brakes work well. For sort of £6,000 or so, this is a decent car. If you want the ultimate in B-road fun, no, go and buy a Mini or something like that. They're going to give you a lot more enjoyment. But as an all-rounder, this is far superior. And actually, considering the age of this, 6 grand, you're not going to get much Mini from 2017, I don't think. This car even claims to have a fairly decent range, close to 400 miles, and we've already gone through about 10% of the fuel tank, so that's pretty good for a little car. Okay, there's some cheap, scratchy bits in it, but you could spend a lot more on a VW and get no better than this. I'd say this is a car that pretty much does what it says on the tin. It's a little bit fruitier than your ordinary, normal, say, 1.4 NA, not quite as fun as your full-fat GTI, but reasonable to run, practical. This is a good car. Is it a cool car for young people? I'm not sure it is. I think a Bluemotion badge is not really going to win you any brownie points, but if you're not worried about that, it's a decent purchase. I'm also very happy to tell you that in the 4 years Tom has owned it, he hasn't had any trouble with it at all, with the sole exception being the rear tyres wearing a little bit unevenly. But that really is it. Costs about £200 a year to service, meaning it is a very, very modest thing to keep on the roads. Thanks to you all for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.